Welcome to the Spirit-Filled Leadership Podcast. I'm Pete Burek. This is a podcast where we believe the world needs disciples and disciples need Spirit-Filled leaders. If you are interested in growing as a Spirit-Filled leader beyond just listening to this podcast, we have a course, a 30-day course called the Spirit-Filled Leadership Intensive course. We're going to be launching a new cohort of people going through it right at the beginning of Lent. So if you're interested in joining us for that, you can go to spiritfilledleadership.com. That's spiritfilledleadership.com to learn more about the intensive and how you can grow over 30 days as a Spirit-filled leader. And just a reminder that if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider liking, subscribing, rating, sharing, doing whatever it is you can to get the word out. We are committed to seeing this community of people grow who want to be Spirit-filled leaders, and you can help us do that by getting the word out. Okay, today's topic is something we came up with called the Failure Helix. The Failure Helix. Basically, it's this. Everything worth doing in life, every accomplishment, every mission, every relationship, including the one with our relationship with the Lord, everything is going to involve some degree of failure. It's going to involve some degree, at least on this side of heaven, where it doesn't go quite right, where we mess it up, where we don't hit the mark, where we're shooting for this and we hit a different part of it, where we think some outcome is coming and a different outcome emerges, where we drop the ball, where we say the wrong thing, or somebody else drops the ball or says the wrong thing, where failure is just an inevitable part of leadership. That no matter what you're trying to lead, no matter who you're trying to lead, whether it's yourself, your family, your company, your organization, your ministry, failure is going to be a part of it. And there's that famous, quote from St. Mother Teresa where she says, I'm not called to be successful, I'm called to be faithful. She says, I'm not called to be successful, I'm called to be faithful. And what is she saying by that? What is faithfulness? Well, faithfulness is ultimately obedience. It's bringing our faith into agreement with the revelation of God of who He is, what we're made for, and what He's calling us to. So in order to be faithful, we have to be obedient. And in order to be obedient, we have to be listening. And we talk a lot about this in this podcast because it's so critical that a leader listens, both to the Lord, to His people, and to themselves. We have to be listening. But in particular, when we're talking about Spirit-filled leadership, in order to be faithful and not preoccupied with being successful, we have to start with being obedient. You cannot lead if you cannot obey. That's key concept number one. You cannot lead if you cannot obey. And the only way we know how to obey is if we're listening and believing the commands, the promises, and the directives from the Lord. When the Spirit guides us to do something and we discern it and believe it in faith, we then have a decision to make as to whether or not we are going to remain in agreement with it or get outside of that. And the interesting part about the Failure Helix and what we're going to talk about today is just because we're obedient doesn't mean we're going to be successful, but it will mean that we are faithful. And if we are faithful, then in the eyes of God, we are doing the right thing, even though sometimes doing the right thing leads to an outcome that the world or ourselves may determine isn't the desired outcome that we were looking for. So an example is we could feel called to do a Bible study in our home. And that might be what the Holy Spirit is inviting us to do. And we feel very committed and convicted that we're called to do something and lead this Bible study. But if only 3 people show up and the goal was to get 10, that could be seen as a failure. But it's not a failure in the eyes of God if you're still being faithful to His decree and you're being obedient to what He's asked us to do. So key point number 1 is you cannot lead if you cannot obey. But even in the midst of obedience and faithfulness, there are going to be these times, like I just described, where the success of the moment isn't there. Failure happens. And all of a sudden, we are left with 2 paths, and this is where the Failure Helix come in. The success and failure are intertwined as part of our journey. And either this moment, these moments of failure and these moments of success either propel us upward into greater holiness and greater union and greater faithfulness to the Lord, or they almost turn into a slide by which we slide deeper into despair, isolation, and detachment from the Lord. So what is the distinction? What is the difference between kind of rising through failure or falling because of failure? So here's a couple of ideas. impact statement number 2. Every victory in life is filled with failure, often in the moment, but definitely in the lead up. Success and failure are intertwined with 2 potential trajectories. This is what I was just talking about. Either this combination leads to growth, happiness, and breakthrough, or it leads to stagnation, despair, and quitting. So, what's the difference? And how do we allow for it to be a propulsion upward as opposed to a kind of a dragging us downward? So, critically, in the kind of the hinge point of the failure helix is a combination, or what I would call humble learning. Humble learning. Humility is critical in this moment because in a moment of failure, our pride, our will, our kind of the weakness in us is going to try to emerge and put the failure on somebody else, blame somebody. We're going to come up with all sorts of excuses. We're going to come up with all sorts of limiting beliefs. We're going to kind of fall back on our wounding, and this is why this happened, and if only this had done. So the first thing in the failure helix is a humble kind of acknowledgement of what has actually happened. A humble acknowledgement of saying, this was my part in it, this may have been somebody else's part in it, and this is, as best as I can tell, the full story of what led to this failure. Because as soon as you do that, as soon as humble acknowledgement emerges, humble acknowledgement leads to humble learning. And what that means is I've acknowledged the situation, and now I've begun a process of learning from this failure, that by combining failure with learning, that actually is the thing that leads to life. But when we do not acknowledge what happened, or we live in some sort of false understanding of it, or some sort of fantasy world of what we think happens, instead of humble acknowledgement leading to learning, if we don't do humble acknowledgement, failure can lead to a type of ignorance of what truly happened, what truly was contributed to the failure. And then that leads to either a repeat of the failure, and then a repeat of the failure, and the repeat of the failure that ultimately leads to some sort of death, some sort of ultimate failure in that process. So failure with ignorance leads to despair and stagnation. Failure with learning leads to hope in life and intentionality. And that's the critical part of the failure helix, is not to try to avoid failure, but to fail fast, fall forward, and recognize that when failure inevitably comes, it's an opportunity for humble acknowledgement of the situation, which leads to learning, which leads to transformation. And this is borne out in the scriptures. We see this over and over again in the lives of the saints and in the scriptures. Just men and women of God who are trying to be faithful and obedient to the Lord, or run from the Lord's command and are not obedient and suffer the consequences. And in moments like that, that's still the failure helix applies. When we sin, when we fall, when we disobey, when we don't do the right thing, and it leads to an undesirable outcome, humble acknowledgement. Do we learn? And then do we resolve to take that learning and do something about it? Or do we ignore the failure? Do we justify the failure? Do we wish it away? And do we remain ignorant of how it came to be? Because that will get us trapped in a loop of continual failure that leads to death. So, key concept number 1, you cannot lead if you cannot obey. Key concept number 2 is allow the failure in your life to lead you through humble acknowledgement to learning, which will lead you to life, as opposed to ignorance, which will lead you to death. Don't be afraid of failure.